Welcome, night owls, to 2-Hour Horror Stories. I'm your host for the next 2 chilling hours. These aren't just bedtime stories, they're terrifying. Subscribe if you dare, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Now, silence your phone, close your eyes, and let the horror in. It was supposed to be a quiet getaway. 3 friends, a remote beach, and no signal. Just the steady hush of the tide, a cooler full of drinks, and the comforting crackle of a fire. They arrived before sunset, just as the sky turned copper and the sea reflected it back in trembling ripples. There wasn't a soul for miles, just sand, water, and the old dunes that rose like sleeping giants behind them. They pitched 2 tents near the dunes, far from the tide but close enough to hear it. When night fell, it fell hard. The kind of blackness that city lights never allow. A suffocating dark. They stayed up late, talking about meaningless things, relationships, work stress, dreams they couldn't quite remember. By the time they crawled into their tents, the fire had died to embers and the cold was crawling in. And in the morning it was there, a red tent, small, weathered, sitting alone near the shoreline. None of them saw it when they arrived. It hadn't been there when they lit the fire, or when they laughed under the stars. But there it was, silent, zipped, unmoving, as if it had always belonged. The fabric looked wet, like it had been pulled straight from the ocean and dropped there. It cast a long shadow across the sand, even though the morning sun was still low. They argued about it at first. Maybe someone came in the night. Maybe it was further down the beach and they hadn't noticed. But none of them heard anything.
No footsteps. No voices.
No vehicle. Nothing but waves and wind. By noon, curiosity outweighed caution. They approached slowly. Each step closer made the silence louder. Not even gulls cried overhead. When they reached it, the tent's zipper was halfway down. No one wanted to finish unzipping it, but one of them did. It was empty.
No sleeping bag. No clothes. No trash. No scent.
Just a floor of damp sand and the faint, briny smell of seawater, as if the ocean had been inside it. They walked around it.
No footprints. No drag marks.
Nothing. It was as if the tent had dropped straight down from the sky, or worse, risen up from beneath. They considered moving it, but no one wanted to touch it. Instead, they returned to their site and tried to ignore it. But the red of the fabric bled into everything. Into their peripheral vision, into the edges of conversation, into their minds. That night, they built a bigger fire. No one said it, but none of them wanted to sleep. The red tent just sat there, unbothered by the wind, the heat of the flames, or the watchful stares it drew. Once, someone thought they saw it shudder. But it could have been the breeze. Could have been. Around midnight, a sound broke the silence. The tent's zipper. It was faint, distant, unmistakable. They froze, and then silence again. One of them swore they saw movement. Just a figure, barely visible, crouched low by the red tent. But when they shone a flashlight, there was nothing. The light revealed only the same still tent, its shadow impossibly long across the sand. At dawn, it was gone.
No fabric. No trace.
Not even the slight depression in the sand where it had sat. As if the beach had forgotten it ever existed. But something had changed. One of the friends, the one who had unzipped it, was different. He spoke less, smiled but not at the right times, laughed at things no one else found funny. He kept staring at the ocean, not watching it, listening to it, leaning his head slightly, like something was whispering from beneath the waves. On the last night of the trip, he went missing. They searched the beach, screaming his name until their throats burned. But there were no signs, no footprints, no belongings taken, no red tent, only the water, endless, black, and calm. They called for help. Search teams came. Drones scanned the shoreline. Dogs sniffed the dunes. No body.
No clues.
Only this. A patch of wet sand down by the water's edge, perfectly square, darker than the rest, where nothing would grow back. Not even months later. They said it was probably the tide. A freak accident. Another camper who wandered too far or got pulled under. But the other two never went back. They never spoke about it publicly. Not until one of them, shaking, pale, broke down and said something strange in an interview. "He's not gone," he whispered. "He's waiting. And the tent, it always comes back. Just not in the same place." What makes this story truly disturbing isn't the tent itself. It's what it implies. The red color, vibrant, unnatural, warning. The lack of origin. The complete absence of human touch. The way it silently invades a space and leaves no trace. It's not just about someone disappearing. It's about a threshold being crossed between the ordinary and something far more ancient. Something that doesn't need to chase or scream or threaten. It only appears and waits. There's a reason the tent didn't show up near crowds or populated beaches. It chose silence, isolation, vulnerability. It's less a structure and more a signal, an invitation to step inside something you don't come back from. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the red tent isn't meant to be found. Maybe it finds you, and when it does, it doesn't ask permission. It just waits for you to unzip it. The footprints began appearing on the third morning. Emily was the first to notice them. Barefoot impressions, sunken slightly into the damp morning sand, leading from the water's edge toward the dunes behind the cottage. They weren't there the night before, and no tide could have washed them in this direction. She pointed them out to her fiancé, Daniel, brushing her thumb over one of the deeper prints. It was almost delicate, narrow heel, small toes, arched like a dancer's foot. Too small for a man. But no one else was supposed to be staying on this stretch of beach. The closest cottage was boarded up, and the others were at least a mile away. Daniel joked that maybe she had sleepwalked, which would have been funny if she didn't feel so sure they weren't hers. They followed the trail for a bit that morning, but it ended in the middle of the sand, as though the person had simply stopped walking and evaporated. No return path, no disturbance around it, just gone. By the next morning, the footprints had returned. A new set, same direction, ocean to shore, but this time closer to the cottage. And again, no one saw or heard a thing. No wind in the night, no sound of water sloshing, just stillness. Emily stopped sleeping well after that. She'd wake up convinced someone was standing at the glass sliding door, watching from the other side. Once, she swore she saw a smudge, a faint, handprint-sized blur, like skin pressed briefly against cold glass. Daniel wiped it clean, claiming it was just condensation. But Emily began locking the bedroom door anyway, just in case. The fourth morning brought a new detail. The footprints now curved slightly, as if circling. Not random or chaotic, deliberate. They began at the ocean, again, but rather than heading straight to the dunes, they arced, trailing just along the back of the cottage, before stopping abruptly beside a half-buried driftwood log. Daniel became uneasy too then, though he didn't want to admit it. He started walking the beach in the afternoons, looking for answers. He spoke to the old man at the nearby fishing pier, who remembered a girl disappearing around these parts 20 years ago. Local kid. Took a swim one night and never came back. Her body was never recovered. The beach was known for its strange tides. That's what everyone said. But tides don't leave footprints heading away from the sea. That night, Emily dreamed of drowning. Cold, black water filled her lungs as a pale face stared back at her from beneath the surface. Its eyes wide, unblinking, watching as she sank. She woke up choking on air, her pillow damp with sweat. Or maybe something else. In the pale blue light before dawn, Emily slipped out of bed and opened the back door. The wind was still. The stars blurred behind a low mist crawling off the waves. And there, once again, were the footprints. But this time, they started beside the house and moved toward the sea. She followed them one by one. Each print was fresh, sharp-edged, undisturbed by wind or tide. The cool sand squeezed between her toes as she walked, matching her pace to the silent trail. 10 feet, 20, 30. And then they stopped, abruptly, mid-stride. The final footprint perched awkwardly on the downward slope toward the water, like someone had lifted themselves suddenly into the air. Emily turned back. The cottage had disappeared into the fog. She couldn't see the house, couldn't hear the world behind her. Just the hush of distant waves and the impression of being watched closely. When she returned, Daniel was gone. His things remained. His shoes, his wallet, his phone charging on the counter. But the bed was cold and untouched. And beside the back door, one new footprint waited in the sand. They filed a report. Local police searched the area. Drones were flown. Dogs brought in. But there were no signs of struggle. No signs of Daniel. Only that footprint. And no prints leaving the cottage. They called it a missing persons case, pending further investigation. Emily left a day later. She moved inland, started therapy, changed her number. But the dreams didn't stop. She never returned to the beach. 6 months later, in a distant city, she walked through a park after a storm. The ground was soft and wet. She passed a pond, the water eerily still despite the wind. And on the path behind her, she noticed them again. Footprints.
Bore.
Leading away from the pond. She turned sharply, expecting someone, anyone, to be there. But the trail simply ended. Mid-stride. No person. No sound. No ripple in the water. Just the feeling that somehow it wasn't finished with her. The footprints led nowhere. But that's not entirely true, is it? They led away from understanding. Away from comfort. Away from the laws we think govern the natural world. Because some things don't walk the earth the way we do. Some things return without reason, without body, without time. And they always leave a trace. Not to show where they're going, but to remind us they still are. The photo was wrong. That's what caught her attention first. Samantha had been flipping through the old scrapbook left behind in the Airbnb when she found it. Tucked between pages of guest notes and faded Polaroids. It showed the beach outside the rental house, dated June 1987. But something didn't sit right. The shoreline was familiar. The rocks, the old lifeguard tower, even the odd curvature of the dunes were all exactly as they looked today. Except there was a man in the tower. A lifeguard. Which was impossible. Because that tower hadn't been used in over 30 years. It was rusted through at the base, deemed unsafe and condemned. Locals used it as a landmark to orient themselves, not as a place anyone could safely climb. Yet there he was, sitting casually on the wooden chair, one leg propped, the other dangling, staring right at the camera. No name.
No caption.
Just the date. That night, the wind howled off the ocean, and something thumped softly against the porch railing. Samantha didn't sleep well. Her dreams were wet and heavy. Something cold watching her from above. The next day she went down to the beach early. The sky was overcast, the water gray and still. No one else was out, just a scattering of gulls. But as she approached the condemned tower, she stopped. There was someone up there, too high to see clearly. Just a silhouette, a figure in red. Her breath caught. Then she laughed it off. Someone must have climbed up for the view. But as she walked closer, the shape didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even shift. She called out, "Hey, that thing's not safe." No reply, just the low groan of wind between the beams. And then blink, and the tower was empty. She stood frozen, unable to explain it. Her heart raced. Had she imagined it? The human brain, she reminded herself, is wired to find faces in shadows, figures in trees, shapes in clouds. Still, she didn't go back down to the beach that evening. That night, her door creaked open on its own around 3:17 a.m. She remembered the exact time because the antique clock in the hallway chimed once as it happened. In the morning, there were wet footprints on the wooden floor. She didn't go looking for answers at first. Some part of her didn't want them. But curiosity is louder than fear when it festers long enough. So she asked around. Locals were hesitant, evasive. A woman at the diner only shook her head when Samantha showed her the photo. "You shouldn't be staying near that tower," she said, wiping her hands on a dishcloth. "We don't talk about it anymore." "Talk about what?" The woman glanced over her shoulder. The boy who drowned. His name had been Connor Hale. Summer job lifeguarding back in 1987. Bright, well-liked. One of those golden kids who looked like they belonged in magazine ads for soda and sunblock. One morning, he went out to rescue a swimmer caught in a rip current and vanished. His body was never recovered. The story should have ended there, but it didn't. Over the years, people began reporting strange sightings. A lifeguard in red standing in the tower, always when no one else was on the beach. He'd be motionless, watching. Sometimes beachgoers would hear a whistle, faint but sharp, warning them out of the water. Once, a child claimed she'd seen someone waving from the tower, only for her parents to find it empty moments later. Some thought it was just local legend, a ghost story spun to keep tourists entertained. But Samantha had seen him. She returned to the tower one last time, drawn by something between dread and obligation. It was just before dusk, and the tide was pulling out, revealing dark rocks like teeth. She stood at the base of the tower, staring up. "What do you want?" she asked. The wind replied, whisper soft. She thought she saw movement, just a flicker, then nothing. That night, her dream was clearer. She was underwater, but not drowning, just drifting. A figure swam above her, reaching down. His eyes were wide, not malicious, just lost. When she woke up, the photo was gone. Not misplaced, gone. The scrapbook page torn clean out. She checked the Airbnb guestbook again. Nothing about the lifeguard. Nothing about the photo. But one comment, dated just 3 weeks earlier, chilled her to the core. "Loved the place. Great beach. Strange how sometimes you feel like someone's watching you from the old tower. Creepy in a fun way. Smiley face, but there was no name.
No signature.
Just a red smudge where a fingerprint might have been." Samantha left the next morning. She didn't tell anyone what she saw, didn't post about it, didn't want attention, but she did do one thing. She called the town and asked if they planned to remove the old tower. The woman on the other end paused. "We tried," she said, "multiple times. Equipment fails. Weather turns." One guy swore the structure changed shape when no one was looking. "Then why not just leave it?" Samantha asked. "We don't want to leave it," the woman said softly. "But maybe it doesn't want to go. So the tower remains, empty, watching. And sometimes, when the beach is quiet and the tide is just right, a lifeguard appears in the old chair. He never moves. He never speaks. But if you look long enough, he might look back. Not to warn you, not to haunt you, but to remember, because the sea doesn't forget the ones it keeps. And some lifeguards never clock out. The beach was empty. That's what made it worse. No footsteps, no gulls, no breeze. Just an endless stretch of sand and the sound of waves breaking in slow, rhythmic pulses like a distant heartbeat. When Ava stepped onto the shore that morning, she knew something wasn't right. She felt it in her throat first, like the air was too thick, then in her feet, as if the sand recoiled with every step she took. She came alone. A week off work, a seaside rental, complete silence. That's what she wanted. A break from city noise and a breakup that had left her numb. She didn't want people, just the sea. The ocean had always made her feel small in a comforting way, like her problems didn't matter here. But as she walked down the shore, something caught her eye. Writing. At first, she assumed it was from the tide dragging driftwood or shells. But the marks were too precise. Letters. Words. Clear and curved, freshly drawn, with no footprints around them. Just one line, half buried by the wind. "Ava, don't turn around." She froze. A prank. Maybe someone saw her arrive. Someone playing a game. But the rental house was half a mile up the dune. She'd seen no one all morning. She looked behind her anyway. Nothing. Just the beach stretching endlessly, her own solitary footprints trailing behind. She told herself it had been there before, that maybe it was meant for someone else. She stepped over it, continued down the shoreline. Shells cracked beneath her sandals. The sea rolled in and out. An hour later, she turned back. There was another message. This one hadn't been there before. She was sure of it. Same looping script, as if traced with a stick, clean and deliberate. You looked. It sees you now. Her skin chilled despite the sun. Ava glanced around again, scanning the dunes, the trees up the hill, the empty shoreline. Still no one. No movement. She walked faster this time, back toward the rental. Every few yards, another line appeared, as if the beach was whispering. It remembers your face. It's older than the ocean. Don't answer it when it speaks. Her legs moved faster. Her throat tightened. She refused to read any more. But the words kept coming, spaced like trail markers, each more frantic than the last. You brought it with you. You thought you could forget. You should never have come alone. By the time she reached the house, her hands were trembling. She shut the door, locked it, closed the blinds. She didn't go back to the beach that day. But when she woke the next morning, the messages were in the yard, carved into the sand just outside her window. Still no footprints. Just letters, immaculate and untouched by wind. Don't sleep tonight. That night, she tried to ignore it. She made tea, watched TV with the volume high. But every few minutes, she'd glance at the window. Nothing moved, but she could feel something waiting. At 2:13 a.m., the static started. Not from the TV, she'd turned that off hours ago. Came from her phone. She hadn't touched it, but the screen lit up on its own, flickering with white noise. Then the text message came through. No number.
No sender.
Just one line. Come outside. She dropped the phone. Her pulse drummed in her ears. Outside, there were no words in the sand anymore. Only a single shape. A spiral wide and deep, carved into the ground with unsettling precision. At its center, a small black stone. Glossy.
Vet.
She stared through the window at it for what felt like hours. She never stepped outside that night. The next morning, the spiral was gone. The stone was on the doorstep. She didn't touch it. She packed her things and left before the sun was fully up. Back in the city, things didn't return to normal. Messages started appearing in other places. Condensation on her mirror. Smudges on car windows. Once, even scratched into the frost on her office building's glass door. Always the same handwriting. Always waiting. You left the shore, but it followed. It never needed the ocean. It just needed you to see it. Her coworkers noticed she stopped talking much. Her apartment grew darker. She never opened the curtains. She kept salt by every entrance, even though she couldn't explain why. But the messages never stopped. One morning, she woke to find her walls covered. Dozens of lines, dozens of warnings, and one question. Do you remember what you did at the lighthouse? She didn't. Not at first. But the name rattled something loose. The lighthouse, a childhood trip, a storm, a moment of fear so intense it had buried itself in the back of her mind. She was 6. She'd wandered from her parents, found herself inside the abandoned structure, alone. She remembered the smell of salt and rust, the flickering light at the top, and a voice that had spoken her name before anyone knew she was missing. A voice that had whispered something she could never repeat. And now, somehow, it was back. Maybe it had waited all these years. Maybe the beach wasn't the place it lived, but the place it spoke best. And maybe, just maybe, it had used her all along to leave it behind. She doesn't leave messages in the sand anymore. She doesn't have to. Now they appear in places no sand has ever touched. And if you ever see your name written in the ground, with no one around, don't read it aloud. That's how it starts. That's how it sees. The fire was still burning. No wind, no storm, no tide could touch it. It started as a normal beach trip, 7 friends, a cooler full of drinks, and a plan to camp overnight on the old crescent shore behind the cliffs. Locals called it Black Hollow, a pocket of sand surrounded by stone walls and tidipools. Not on the tourist maps. Quiet, undisturbed. They built the bonfire right in the center. Driftwood, dry and cracked, snapped easily as they stacked it. Jacob lit the first match, and within seconds, the flames rose tall, orange, and dancing in the salty breeze. They drank, told ghost stories, laughed too loud. But around midnight, someone noticed the fire wasn't dying down. Not even slightly. "We haven't added wood in hours," said Mel, frowning. "It should have started shrinking by now." Jacob tossed in another log anyway, maybe to shake the mood. But the flame didn't react, it just stayed the same size, almost like it had already consumed it before it even touched the coals. By 2 a.m., everyone noticed it. No ash.
No smoke.
No smell. Just a silent, flickering flame, locked in place like a video loop. No crackling.
No embers.
Just a fire. Will threw a towel over it, jokingly. Caught fire instantly and vanished in seconds. But again, no smoke. No sound. Just the same constant flame, unfazed, unchanged. That's when Jenna checked her phone. No service. No GPS signal. No stars above, only thick, clouded blackness, though the forecast had been clear. Her battery dropped from 84% to dead in seconds. Every flashlight flickered out one by one. Only the bonfire remained, bright as ever. And suddenly, it was the only light left. They should have left then, packed up and climbed the trail over the cliffs. But something stopped them. A feeling, a pressure in the chest. Not fear, something deeper. Like the shore was leaning in, holding its breath. Like they were no longer alone. They sat in silence, staring at the flames. Time passed, but no one knew how much. Watches stopped. Phones bricked. They tried putting it out with sand. Hissed briefly, but nothing changed. They poured their water on it. The flames stayed. When Will finally stepped forward and tried to kick apart the logs, he screamed. But not from pain. From silence. His mouth was open, face twisted, but no sound came out. He backed away, tripping, hyperventilating. The others ran to him, but he could only whisper one word. Nothing. Nothing in his ears. Nothing in his head. Just a vacuum of thought, emotion, noise. He said it felt like the flame took his voice for a second. They should have run, but they stayed. Something about the fire made it impossible to leave. Not physically, no force held them back. But every time someone stood and looked toward the cliff path, the beach seemed larger, like it had stretched. The bonfire was always the same distance behind them, no matter how far they walked. The night never ended.
No sonrise.
No sounds of birds. Just the roaring tide and that silent fire. Jacob snapped first. Around what felt like the next day, or maybe it was the same one, just looping, he walked into the ocean. He said he could hear something calling from beneath the waves, promising a way out. They found his shoes, but not him. The fire burned on. Mel started talking to it. Not out loud, just subtle gestures, eye movements, like she was in sync with it. She claimed it was showing her something. Visions. A world beneath this one. Older. Quieter. She said it had always been here, feeding on time, on attention. "It's not fire," she whispered once, eyes wide. "It's a mouth." The others tried burying it with sand, rocks, even driftwood. But nothing changed. Every attempt just disappeared. Gone before it touched the light. On what must have been the third night, they saw something in the flames. A shape, human-like, watching, waiting. Its outline shimmered, like it was standing just beyond the fire, behind a curtain of heat. Every time someone blinked, it seemed closer. Will stopped eating. Jenna wouldn't sleep. Eventually, the remaining 4 tried leaving together, running up the trail as fast as they could. But when they crested the hill, they were back at the bottom, standing by the fire again. No memory of turning around.
No breathlessness.
Just there. Like the beach didn't want them to go. One by one, they broke. By the time rescue came, if that's what it was, only Mel remained, sitting by the flame, eyes vacant. The others were gone.
No trace.
She was found by a hiker who stumbled upon the cove after hearing whispers on the wind. The fire was still burning. Even in daylight, it cast shadows in the wrong direction. The hiker tried to put it out. Failed. Authorities returned with sand, extinguishers, even tried digging up the entire pit. Nothing worked. Eventually, they gave up and fenced it off. Labeled it a memorial, a freak phenomenon. But to this day, if you find your way down to Black Hollow, the bonfire is still there. Still flickering. Still untouched by wind, water, or time. They say sometimes it shows faces. Familiar ones. Sometimes your own. And if you stare long enough, you'll feel it too. That whisper in the back of your mind. That pulse in your chest. Does not fire. Does hunger. And it knows your name. She never screamed when the waves pulled her under. That's what the others remembered most. One moment, Maya was waist-deep in the water, laughing with the tide. The next, she was just gone.
No struggle, no splash.
Just silence. And then, almost imperceptibly, a whisper, carried in the wind. It wasn't her name. It wasn't in any language they knew. But somehow, they understood it meant she wouldn't be coming back. 2 weeks later, the beach reopened. The ocean had returned to its usual rhythm, dragging the past away with each pull of the tide. But something had changed in the way the water moved, just slightly off, just enough to notice if you watched too long. Locals started talking about it quietly, the way people talk about bad dreams they're still trying to forget. It began with sound. Visitors reported hearing strange noises near the shoreline at night. Not the usual lapping of waves or gulls overhead, but something quieter. Whispering. Beneath the surface, beneath the foam. Soft, coaxing voices that seemed to come from inside their own heads. Somehow cold, salt-soaked, and ancient. One man claimed he heard the ocean tell him a secret. He wouldn't say what it was. He just packed his things, drove home, and refused to speak of the beach again. Others weren't so lucky. A teenage girl wandered into the surf one evening and returned screaming. She said the water tried to crawl inside her ears. They found her unconscious on the sand an hour later, her hands covering her head like she was trying to hold something in. Most people laughed it off. Just stories. Ocean madness. But the whispers kept coming. An elderly couple staying at the nearby rental cottage said they heard 2 distinct voices each night around 3:13 a.m. Not coming from the sea, but from under the floorboards, wet and low, like someone whispering through waterlogged lungs. Their dog wouldn't go near the shoreline anymore. It stood facing the ocean for hours some nights, growling low, tail between its legs. And then came the mirror tide. Every few nights, the waves would pull back farther than normal, revealing a slick stretch of black sand littered with things that had no place on a beach. Rusted keys. Wedding rings. Old rotary phones with broken dials. One night, someone found a faded photo half buried in the sand. 3 people smiling at a birthday party that, by the look of their clothes, had taken place decades ago. No one recognized them. The photo was dry. People started saying the ocean wasn't returning things it had taken. It was returning things it never should have had. Theories emerged that the beach was a kind of thin place, one of those rare spots where the veil between reality and something older wore thin. Some believed the whispers were memories, echoes of the drowned, trying to finish their last thoughts. Others thought it was something else entirely, something that had been sleeping, something that feeds on attention and was waking up because we kept listening. A local diver named Isaac claimed he went out past the shallows with a hydrophone, hoping to capture the sounds underwater. He surfaced within minutes, shaking. His recording was mostly static, but underneath it, layered low, was what sounded like his own voice whispering back to him. Except it was saying things he swore he'd never thought. He moved inland 2 days later, left his wetsuit behind. There's one more story, one that never made the papers. A group of friends, late 20s, rented a beachfront house to get away from the noise of the city. They weren't believers. They made jokes about the Whisper Beach, even played a drinking game around who could stay in the water longest at night. Around 2 a.m., one of them, Leo, decided to swim out farther than the others dared. He said he wanted to prove there was nothing out there. He never came back. When the Coast Guard searched the area, they found no signs of distress. But they did recover something strange. An old, corroded bell tangled in seaweed, buried just below the tide line. It wasn't a ship's bell. It had carvings on it, symbols that didn't match any known language. One of the rescuers rang it just once. That night, everyone staying in the rental house heard whispers coming from the drain in the bathtub. Every drain, in fact. The sinks, the toilet, the shower. All of them whispered the same thing over and over. Not Leo. Welcome back. They left before sunrise. No one knows where the bell is now. Some say it was taken by the tide again. Others say it's still there, buried deeper, waiting for someone else to ring it. But ask anyone who's stayed on that beach long enough, and they'll tell you the same thing. The ocean doesn't forget, and sometimes it doesn't forgive. But the most unsettling part? The whispers aren't always from the sea anymore. Some people say they've heard them miles inland, while washing dishes, taking a shower, standing near an open window when the wind picks up just right. They say the voices speak softly at first, like a lullaby you almost recognize. But if you listen too long, they start to ask questions. Do you remember me? Do you miss the water? Don't you want to come back? And the worst part isn't hearing them. It's when you realize you've started whispering back. They buried him at sea because there was no other place left for him. The tide carried his coffin into the gray horizon, and for a moment, the ocean seemed still, like it had accepted him. But 3 nights later, someone knocked on the cabin door, and the sound was wet. Brielle wasn't supposed to be alone that weekend. The beach house had been her parents' before the hurricane gutted most of the shoreline years ago. It stood at the edge of the bay, just high enough on the cliffside to escape the floods, but low enough that you could hear the waves inside your dreams. After the storm, most neighbors moved away. The beach was quiet now. Too quiet. She arrived Friday afternoon to the scent of mildew and salt rot. The front door stuck in the frame like it didn't want to be opened. As she stepped inside, sand crunched under her shoes. Not much had changed. The place was still draped in old sheets and the silence of forgotten summers. But something about it felt off. The air was heavier than it should have been. Listening, she told herself she needed the weekend away. Clear her head. That's what people do after funerals, right? They disappear for a while. Grieve. Forget. But she hadn't come to forget. She came because she couldn't stop remembering. The funeral had been simple. Closed casket.
No wake. No priest.
No body to speak of, really just what they pulled from the undertow. They said it was an accident. A riptide. He'd gone in alone despite the warnings. But Brielle knew him better than that. Mason wouldn't have swum out that far unless something called him. The first night passed quietly. The sea murmured its restless language below the cliff, and the wind scratched at the window screens. She stayed up too late scrolling through old messages, replaying voice notes just to hear his laugh again. At one point, her phone buzzed with a notification. Audio file recovered, but she hadn't deleted anything. It was a clip she didn't recognize. Just static at first. Then a low gurgle, wet, breathless, like someone trying to speak underwater. And faintly, her name, Brielle. She shut the phone off and buried it under a pillow. The second night, the knocking started. At exactly 3:12 a.m., 3 sharp knocks echoed through the beach house. Not at the front door, not at the back, but beneath the floorboards. She froze in bed, heart pounding. Knock, 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 then silence.
No footsteps.
No creaking wood, just the sound of the waves crashing below, over and over like something trying to crawl its way up the cliff. The next morning, she checked the basement door. Locked, dust-covered. No signs anyone had been inside for years. Still, the knocks returned that night, same time, same rhythm. By the 4th night, the ocean had gone completely still. She stood by the window, staring at the calm waters. No wind.
No waves.
The tide had pulled so far back it left the bay looking like a massive, gaping wound. The beach was bare, and in the center of it stood a figure, dripping, motionless, facing the house. She turned away to grab her phone, but when she looked back, he was gone. That night, the knocking changed. It started with the usual 3 knocks, but this time, it echoed through the walls like the whole house was hollow. She backed into the hallway, clutching a flashlight that barely worked. That's when she heard it. A voice, muffled,
Vet.
from behind the bathroom mirror. "Let me in." She ran, out of the house, across the crumbling path, barefoot and shaking. The beach was cold and glistening under a sliver of moonlight.
No footprints.
No figure, just the sound of dripping from somewhere behind her, like someone walking through water, but there was no water left. She stopped when she reached the spot where she'd seen him. The sand was darker here, softer. It swallowed her feet like it wanted more. And in the silence, she heard a memory that wasn't hers. Screams, choking, a splash, a struggle, and then a knock from beneath her. She dropped to her knees, heart hammering, and dug with shaking hands. Only inches beneath the surface, her fingers brushed something smooth, cold, a face. She screamed, but the mouth beneath the sand was already open. She stumbled backward as the ground caved slightly, just enough to suggest something had shifted underneath. Something that had been waiting. Back at the house, she locked every door, every window, boarded the fireplace, sat with her back to the basement door, waiting. She didn't sleep. She didn't blink. The knock returned at 3:12 a.m., but this time it wasn't from beneath her. It was at the front door. 3 knocks, then silence, then another 3 from the back, then the windows, one by one, each pane rattling like it was being tested. And then the phone rang. She answered, trembling. No one spoke, just the sound of water dripping, and behind it his voice. "You left me," she whispered. "You're dead." And he answered,
No.
"I was taken." Then static. She fled the house before dawn, never returned. But others did. Tourists,
Campers.
renters, and they all report the same thing. That around 3 a.m., when the tide goes quiet and the air goes thick, someone knocks. Sometimes from below, sometimes from behind the mirror. And if you answer, the door won't close again. The locals say it's just an old ghost story, something to keep kids from wandering too far out to sea. But Brielle knows better, because sometimes, when the beach is empty and the wind dies down, you can still see a man standing at the shoreline, dripping, waiting, knocking. The sand was warm beneath her toes, but something about the air felt wrong. Claire stood still for a moment, letting the wind whip through her hoodie, eyes fixed on the endless stretch of shoreline that had emptied minutes before sunset. Families packed their coolers, kids dragged boogie boards, but she stayed behind. She liked the quiet until she noticed it was too quiet. The gulls had stopped circling. The waves, once constant, now lapped irregularly. And even the wind had settled into a strange, expectant stillness. She dug her bare feet into the sand absent-mindedly, eyes scanning the horizon, when something beneath the surface gripped her ankle. She froze, not out of fear but because of the temperature. It was ice cold, not ocean cold, not wind chilled, but the kind of cold that burns, that seeps directly into the marrow. Claire didn't scream, not at first. She assumed it was seaweed, maybe a buried shell, but when she tried to move her foot, she felt it. 5 fingers, clasping her ankle from under the sand. She jerked backward, stumbling and falling. Her heel tore out of the grip, but the imprint remained. A handprint in the sand, already beginning to fade as if it had never been there. Breathing heavily, she looked around. No one, not a single soul for miles. And yet she swore she could hear something breathing, not her own. It was slow, shallow, as if something hidden just beneath the surface of the sand was trying not to be heard. Claire didn't return to her car. Not yet. She knelt down, pressing a shaking hand to the spot. It was warm now, just like the rest of the beach, but her ankle still burned with cold, a circle of numbness that hadn't faded. Something had touched her. Something not alive, at least not anymore. She didn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt it again, that grip. Not violent, just insistent, like it was trying to pull her down not out of anger, but desperation. By morning, she convinced herself it was nothing more than a half-dream. Stress, maybe, her mind playing tricks, until she saw the bruise. Her ankle was marked. 5 thin finger-shaped spots, evenly spaced, a purplish blue. Too defined to be random, too cold to be forgotten. Claire went back the next day. Not out of bravery, but obsession. The tide had shifted. That section of the beach was different now, scattered with driftwood and washed-up kelp. But she knew the exact spot. Her footprint was gone, of course, but the feeling wasn't. The silence returned the moment she stepped past the dunes. That waiting hush, as if the beach itself recognized her. She dug, hands shaking. She clawed at the sand, faster, deeper, until her fingers hit something solid. She expected a rock, maybe a shell, but it was neither. It was a wrist, pale, cold, human. She yanked her hand back, stumbling again, staring into the shallow pit she had carved. But when she blinked, it was gone. Smooth sand, unbroken, as if nothing had been there at all. Claire didn't run. She stood, trembling, listening, and then she heard the whisper. It wasn't words. Not exactly. Just a feeling pressed directly into her brain like an intrusive thought. Help me. Not in her ears, but inside her. She backed away, slowly, never turning her back on the sand. That night, her dreams were different. Not nightmares, worse. They felt real. She was beneath the beach, buried just below the surface, staring upward through grains of shifting sand. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, but she could feel. She felt the vibration of footsteps, the pull of the tide, and above all, loneliness. When she woke, there was sand under her nails. She showered, scrubbed, burned the clothes she wore to the beach. But the cold stayed in her bones, and the whisper returned nightly. More clear, more demanding. Each night, she dreamed she was buried. Each day, she felt drawn back to that place. She researched missing persons, drownings, legends, anything to explain it. There was no record, no news, no folklore, just the growing certainty that something under that beach was real, and it wanted out. Claire started drawing her dreams. Maps of underground tunnels, pale faces with hollow eyes, fingers curled in the sand. She wasn't an artist, but the images poured out of her like memory. Friends noticed. She stopped going to work, to class, to sleep, and then the footprints began appearing in her apartment. Sand on the doormat, a single handprint on her bathroom mirror, 5 long fingers, trailing condensation even though the glass was dry. The beach had followed her, or maybe she had never really left it. Claire returned one last time. She wrote a note, short and simple. It's not trying to hurt us. It's trying to be remembered. That was 2 years ago. Her car was found in the beach parking lot. Keys inside. Engine cold. She was never seen again. But some people say when the tide is low and the night is still, you can feel it, the cold. Not in the water, in the sand. They say if you dig in the right spot, you might feel a hand. Not violent, just reaching, waiting. And if you leave it there, you might just dream of her. Standing by the shore, hand outstretched, trying to tell you something you can't quite hear. Or worse, trying to pull you in. Because maybe the ocean isn't what claims us. Maybe it's the sand. The silent, shifting sand that remembers every footprint, every scream, and every soul that never made it out. And maybe, just maybe, some of them are still trying. She never should have stayed after sunset. The signs were everywhere. The rapid drop in temperature, the distant fog crawling over the waves, the sharp silence that swallowed the sounds of other people. But she had told herself it was peaceful, serene, a much-needed break from the chaos of her everyday life. So she lay back on her blanket, just beyond the tide's reach, listening to the rhythm of the ocean. Her eyes closed, lulled by that hypnotic push and pull of the sea. Sleep came quickly, too quickly. When she opened her eyes again, it was still dark, but something was wrong. The air smelled sharper, like salt thickened by decay. Wind blew against her face, not the lazy breeze of the beach. This wind was colder, hollow, whispering in a way that felt aware. She sat up, slowly, and her heart collapsed into a tight, impossible knot. There was no sand beneath her anymore, no land at all. She was on a boat, a small wooden rowboat, aged and splintered, gently rocking in the middle of endless black water.
No oars. No motor.
Just her, adrift under a sky so dark the stars looked like they were watching. Panic rose like a scream she couldn't release. She scrambled to the edge and peered overboard. Nothing.
No shore. No sounds.
No boats, no buildings, not even waves hitting the hull. Just stillness, as if the entire sea had gone breathless. She hadn't dreamed it. She remembered the sand between her toes, the warmth, the quiet hum of people in the distance. Had someone moved her here? Drugged her? But there was no sign of struggle.
No bruises.
Her blanket was gone. Her sandals too. Only her clothes remained, and they were dry. She stood, wobbling on the unsteady floor of the boat. "Hello?" she called, voice cracking in the stillness. Nothing. Not even an echo. Then she heard it. A soft splash. Gentle. Almost delicate. Like fingertips breaking the surface. She turned. A figure, maybe 20 feet away, barely visible, only a silhouette in the moonlight. Floating. Watching. Unmoving. There were no ripples around it. No sign it had swum there. Just a black shape. Half submerged. Head above water. Human, maybe, but she couldn't see a face. She didn't speak. Didn't move. Just stared. Then the figure tilted its head. Slowly. Curiously. And vanished beneath the surface. She gasped and stumbled backward in the boat. Her breath came in shallow bursts, chest tightening like a vice. She waited, bracing for something to slam against the boat, to pull her under. But the water remained calm. Too calm. The moon dimmed slightly behind drifting clouds, and for the first time she noticed how unnatural the sky looked. The stars were wrong, clustered into unfamiliar shapes, glimmering in faint pulses instead of twinkling, almost as if they were communicating, observing. She sat back down, curling into herself, trying to rationalize. Maybe she'd had a breakdown. Maybe she wandered off in her sleep. But no explanation held weight. She didn't remember walking. There were no footprints, no transition. One moment she was on solid earth. The next, adrift. And then, she noticed something else. The boat wasn't drifting randomly. It was circling. A slow, tight spiral. Moving inward toward something she couldn't see. A black center that looked darker than the ocean itself. Not a whirlpool, there was no movement. Just a hole in the world. Like the water refused to touch whatever waited there. Something began to rise from it. It wasn't violent or fast. It didn't erupt. It just surfaced. A structure. Obsidian-colored and smooth, with no angles, no seams. Impossible to measure. One moment it was the size of a shed. The next it loomed above her like a cathedral. The boat stopped, perfectly still. No more circling. No more movement. She tried to look away but couldn't. Something deep in her mind resisted turning her head. Like this thing had gravity not just over the ocean but her thoughts. It demanded attention. And then, a voice. It wasn't heard. It was felt. A presence blooming behind her eyes, echoing in the hollow places of her mind. Spoke not in words, but in emotion. And what it conveyed was simple. You left something behind. Images surged through her head. Memories she didn't remember having. A dark beach. A storm that hadn't come. An offering made under blood-colored skies. And her, standing at the shoreline, whispering something she'd promised never to say again. That was the trade. Sleep on the beach and it will take you back. Back to the place where it started. Where she made a pact she thought she imagined. She hadn't known it would come to collect. Not now. Not like this. The surface of the black structure rippled like water. A doorway formed, round and pulsing like a pupil constricting. The boat began to move again. Slowly. Toward the entrance. She wanted to jump, to dive into the ocean and swim away. But her body wouldn't listen. Her limbs stayed locked in place, not paralyzed, just obedient. As if some old part of her remembered this. She was almost at the threshold when she looked down and saw her reflection in the water. But it wasn't her. The face looking up was older, haggard, hollow-eyed and wet-haired, with a look of bitter recognition. It mouthed a word she didn't say. Return. And then the boat passed through. Darkness swallowed her. When she opened her eyes again, she was back on the beach. Morning sun overhead. Gulls calling. People walking by unaware. Her blanket was there. Her sandals too. She was safe. Except the water was still. Perfectly still.
No waves.
No wind. And in the distance, out beyond the reach of the horizon, she could see a tiny, unmoving boat. Empty. Just floating. Watching. She never spoke of it. Never told anyone. But sometimes, when she slept too close to the edge, she'd hear it again. The voice in her head, whispering gently, "You never really left." And maybe she didn't, because sometimes she wakes up and the stars above her don't twinkle the way they should. They pulse. They watch. And she knows the sea never forgets its debts. They found the house by accident. It wasn't marked on the vacation rental sites. No signs pointed to it from the winding coastal road. Even satellite images of the stretch between mile markers 83 and 85 showed only empty dunes, seagrass, and gray shoreline. But when Ethan and Mara turned down an unmarked gravel path, just to find a quiet place to park and eat lunch, it was suddenly there. 2 stories, weathered but intact, faded blue shutters barely holding on, and a wraparound porch leaning just slightly to the left. Its windows reflected nothing but ocean. No for sale sign.
No mailbags.
No hint of ownership. Yet it looked lived in. Mara thought maybe it was a privately owned vacation spot. Ethan, curious and impulsive, suggested taking a closer look. Just a peek. Just to say they did. The air changed as they stepped out of the car. Windless. Quiet. Even the gulls seemed to avoid the area. Each footstep on the sand felt muffled, like sound itself didn't want to travel here. They walked up the creaking steps. The front door wasn't locked. Inside, stillness, but not abandonment. A blanket folded over a worn leather chair. Sand in the corners, but no dust. A faint scent of salt, old wood, and something else. Something unfamiliar like lavender left to rot. They called out. No answer. No movement. Then Mara saw it. A photograph on the mantelpiece. Blurred from age and sun, but unmistakably her. Not a doppelganger. Her. Same birthmark near the jaw. Same necklace she was wearing right now. In the photo, she was standing in front of the house, smiling. She'd never been here before. At least she thought she hadn't. Ethan laughed it off. Said it must be a coincidence. An old tenant who looked like her. But his voice didn't sound right when he said it. It was too thin, too forced. They should have left right then. But something made them stay. Not fascination. Not even fear. Felt more like obligation. The house seemed to shift as they moved. Hallways felt longer the second time through. The kitchen window faced the ocean, until it didn't. Cabinets hung at slightly crooked angles. The fridge hummed quietly, even though it wasn't plugged in. They found more photos. Some in drawers. Some behind mirrors. All of them strange. In one, Ethan stood by the front porch, older, grayer, staring blankly into the lens. In another, Mara sat alone on the staircase, her eyes open wide and glassy. None of these were recent photos. They looked decades old. Ethan insisted it was a prank. Maybe someone had accessed their social media, made fake prints, planted them here, but the timestamps were off. The photos were aged, paper yellowed, edges curled. They tried to leave. The front door opened to the beach as expected. But the sand was wrong. It was completely smooth.
No footsteps.
No wind. No sound. The sky had dimmed unnaturally, as if someone had turned the brightness down on reality itself. And then the door slammed shut. They didn't run. Not yet. Not out of denial, but because it felt expected. Like the house was watching and running would be too obvious. They explored instead. opened doors they hadn't noticed before. A bedroom with no bed. A closet filled with shoes all the same size. A bathroom mirror that reflected the room but not them. In the attic they found a journal. Handwritten, dated entries. The most recent was 3 days ago. They always find the house. It shows itself when they're ready. You can't run from what waits for you here. You can only meet it. The entry was signed, shakily, by someone named Ethan. The handwriting was his. He dropped the journal. Mara didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She'd found her name written in dozens of other pages. Sometimes crossed out, rewritten, scribbled into the margins. By then, the rooms had started changing faster. The layout blurred between old and new. Some doors now opened into nothing but darkness. Others into versions of the same room that didn't match the floor plan. At some point, Ethan opened a door and didn't return. Mara waited. She waited until the sky outside turned white. Not day, just white, and the ocean began rising but never reached shore. She finally stepped out alone. There was no car, no road, only the house behind her, smaller now, distant, fading like a dream on the edge of waking. She walked for hours, eventually found the main highway, hitchhiked into town, reported the incident. They found no house, no path, no sign anyone had ever lived along that stretch of coast. No photos of Ethan remained on her phone. No trace of him in the hotel registry. Their shared vacation? Not booked under his name. Only hers. Weeks passed. She tried to rebuild her life. Told herself it was a shared hallucination or an elaborate breakdown. Until she passed a real estate office downtown and saw a listing in the window. Faded blue shutters. Wraparound porch. No address. The listing said only beachfront opportunity. Waiting for the right buyer. She didn't go inside. Not that day. But she walked past again. And again. Each time, the pull grew stronger. The tide was unusually calm that evening, so still it almost didn't seem real. No wind. No crashing waves. Just the mirror-like stretch of ocean reflecting the dimming sky. And her. A woman in a white sundress, barefoot, walking toward the water. People saw her. Families, couples, lifeguards. They all remembered her. And they all swore the same thing. She walked into the sea and never sank. Not a ripple. Not a splash. No resistance. She just kept walking deeper and deeper until the water should have swallowed her whole. But it didn't. The footage from that night, grainy and discolored from a nearby pier camera, confirmed their memories. The timestamp, 7:23 p.m. The woman enters the frame. She walks down the sand slowly, as if in a trance, arms slightly swaying at her sides. And as she reaches the shore, her steps don't falter. The water parts faintly around her ankles, then her knees. But instead of submerging her, the ocean appears to accommodate her. As though it made room. They never saw her again. No missing person report. No abandoned car. No shoes left behind. No one matching her description was ever linked to the incident. And yet, for months after, locals reported strange things. Shadows flickering beneath the surface during low tide. Sudden cold patches in the sand. And sometimes at sunset, someone would swear they saw her again, standing just at the water's edge, always facing away. Some believe it was a shared hallucination, a psychological trick of the light. But the eyewitnesses, some of whom didn't know each other, remember her the same way. The white dress, the dark, wet hair, the slow, steady walk, unblinking, silent, not a trace of fear. A woman named Clara, who visited the beach that day, became obsessed. She was one of the first to post about it online, calling the figure the Lady of the Horizon. In her blog, she wrote how the woman's presence felt rehearsed, like she had done this before, like the ocean knew her, and maybe more disturbingly, obeyed her. Clara returned to that beach dozens of times over the next few months. She interviewed lifeguards, surfers, local fishermen. One man, an elderly vendor who sold ice cream near the boardwalk, told her an unsettling story. He claimed that when he was a child, a girl from his class had drowned not far from that very same stretch of sand. She had fallen off a jetty during a school field trip, and her body was never found. He didn't remember her name, just that she wore a white dress. Coincidence, perhaps, or maybe, as Clara speculated, it wasn't a drowning. Maybe the sea had taken her willingly, chosen her, and maybe she never left. The beach gained a reputation after that. Not infamous, not haunted exactly, but avoided. People stopped swimming alone. A few teenagers tried to recreate the walk as a dare, but they never got far. Some said the water became freezing cold the moment they stepped in. Others claimed they felt watched, judged. Clara's blog stopped updating 6 weeks after her last post. Her final entry described a dream. In it, she was standing at the water's edge, staring into the distance. The ocean was perfectly still, silent, and just as she turned to leave, she saw herself, another version of her, already waist-deep, walking calmly into the water, never looking back. The post ended with a single line. "I think she was waiting for me to notice." Some dismiss the entire story as online fiction, a well-crafted digital myth. But that doesn't explain the video. The pier camera footage still exists, though copies are difficult to find. Most have been taken down, flagged as inconclusive or doctored. But those who've seen it insist it's real. And then there's the pattern. Several similar sightings have occurred in other coastal towns, decades apart. Always a woman in white, always silent, always walking into the water. In one 1978 report from a beach in Maine, 2 children claimed to see a woman floating above the ocean floor, just under the surface, eyes wide open. A fisherman in 1994 off the Gulf Coast swore a woman's reflection stared up at him from the water, except no one else was there. These aren't just ghost stories. They're too consistent, too specific. What if this isn't one woman, but something else entirely?
À manifestation.
A guardian, a gatekeeper, or worse, an invitation. Think about the ocean, its depth, the silence, how it erases, not just bodies but memories, evidence, identity. We assume it's indifferent. But what if it's not? What if it remembers? What if some people are called? The woman who walked into the water and never sank wasn't breaking the laws of physics. She was following a path, one that's been tread before. A ritual, maybe, a surrender, a crossing over into something we were never meant to understand. Maybe she wasn't human anymore. Maybe she never was. And maybe, just maybe, one day you'll look up from your beach towel. The sky will dim, the waves will still, and you'll see her, standing at the shoreline, waiting for the tide to pull you under, not to drown you, but to welcome you home. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway. Just 3 friends, a quiet beach on the edge of nowhere, and a rented cabin older than their grandparents. No cell service, no traffic, just the crashing waves and a sky so black it swallowed the stars. They found the fire pit on the second night, buried under overgrowth behind the cabin. Half-buried stones formed a rough circle, and the sand inside had long since turned gray with ash. One of them joked that it looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. But it wasn't the fire pit that was strange. It was the arrangement of small, rusted nails they found in a perfect spiral under the sand. Nails and something white, something hard. They brushed the sand away and uncovered what looked like a piece of bone. It didn't look like driftwood. It was smooth, porous, rounded like it had once been part of a socket. Not large, but not animal either. No one said what they were all thinking, but each one of them stopped smiling when they held it. Still, they lit the fire that night. The flames struggled at first, flickering against the salty breeze. But once they caught, they roared, higher and brighter than it made sense for them to burn. Even the damp wood they'd gathered seemed eager to ignite. They told themselves it was the wind, the air, maybe even a hidden chemical in the sand. They laughed too loudly, drank too much, trying to drown out the feeling that something had watched the spark take hold. At midnight, the fire snapped loud enough to make them jump. The flames flared blue for a second, unnatural and cold, and from somewhere just beyond the reach of the light, they heard it. A single, sharp laugh. They stopped talking, looked around, but the beach was empty, only the tide creeping in and the fire hissing against the night. One of them said it was just the wind, but no one laughed with him. When they went back inside, none of them could sleep. The walls of the cabin creaked like they were breathing, like old lungs trying to remember air. The wind came from all directions. In the morning, they returned to the fire pit. The ashes were gone. Not scattered, gone. Only the bone remained, now completely unearthed. Clean, as if something had polished it overnight. They should have left, but curiosity always wins. They kept digging, carefully at first, but with every handful of sand they tossed aside, more fragments surfaced. Teeth, knuckles, vertebrae curled like a question mark. Not a full skeleton, just pieces, and none of them old enough to have crumbled. They looked preserved, as if someone or something wanted them to be found. By the fourth day, the beach started to feel different. Colder, grayer. Even under sunlight, the sky seemed overcast. And the fire pit, it never stayed buried. Even when they tried to cover it again, it would be cleared by morning. They started to dream the same dream. A woman with no face, standing in the fire, whispering their names in reverse. Always reverse. Her arms were crossed over her chest like she'd been buried. Not dead, but waiting. One of them woke up with ash in their mouth. Another with sand under their fingernails, though none remembered leaving the cabin at all. By the end of the week, they stopped speaking about it. The laughter died. They kept their eyes down. One by one, they began to sit around the fire again at night. Not because they wanted to, but because they felt pulled to it. Like gravity. Or guilt. On the last night, they found something new. A rusted locket, half melted, at the edge of the pit. Inside was a photo so faded it looked like a smudge. But behind that was a scrap of fabric. And writing, carved into the locket's inner rim. She only burns when forgotten. That night, the fire wouldn't light. They tried everything. The wood was dry. The wind was still. But the flames refused to catch. The pit remained cold, as if whatever lived in it had left. That was the last night they stayed. They didn't speak on the drive back. Didn't share what they saw when they closed their eyes. But they all remembered the silence. The way the pit looked like a grave too shallow to hide what lay beneath it. Years later, one of them returned. He was older, worn down. He didn't believe in ghosts. Told himself it had been paranoia or group hysteria. Until he found the pit still there, untouched, unchanged. And inside it, the bones were gone. But the nails had returned. He didn't tell the others. He didn't stay the night. He only walked back to the rental car, feeling the air shift behind him like someone was following. Watching, waiting for him to forget again. Some things don't want to be buried. Some fires don't want to die. And sometimes, the beach doesn't wash things away, keeps them. There's a light that shines across the dunes at night. It's faint, just a flicker at first, almost like a distant star, barely noticeable if you're not paying attention. But if you do, if you really focus on it, it calls to you. And when it calls, you won't be able to resist. No one who's ever gone looking for that light has returned the same. In the summer of 2013, a group of friends, 3 young men, decided to take a late-night walk across the sand dunes near a remote beach in the Pacific Northwest. They had been camping for a few days, their campsite a few miles away from the nearest town. The night was clear, the stars almost blinding in their brilliance. But then, as they sat by the campfire, one of them noticed something strange. A faint light, far out near the edge of the dunes, flickering on and off like a lantern. At first, they thought it was just the light of a fellow camper. But after some time, when no one else appeared, they grew curious. A bet was placed. Who dares to go out there and check it out? Ben, the bravest of the 3, volunteered almost immediately. He was the kind of person who always craved adventure, never one to back down from a challenge. His friends chuckled nervously but didn't stop him as he grabbed a flashlight, promising he'd be back in a few minutes. They watched him walk toward the light, his figure growing smaller as he moved further across the sand. Minutes passed, and the light remained steady, still flickering on the horizon. It seemed distant but was strangely constant. Maybe too constant. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, the light vanished. Just disappeared. Ben didn't return. His friends called out for him, their voices echoing across the dunes, but there was no response. Panic started to rise as they jumped to their feet, scanning the dark expanse of the dunes. They couldn't see him. They couldn't hear him. One of them, Jake, started running in the direction Ben had gone, his heart racing as the dread began to settle in. The other followed reluctantly. The air felt different now, thicker, almost suffocating. As they moved further into the dunes, the terrain became more uneven, the sand crunching underfoot. Their flashlights barely illuminated anything past their own immediate surroundings. The wind had picked up, whipping the sand in their faces, but they pressed on. The beach, which had seemed so comforting just hours ago, now felt alien, and they hadn't even realized it until they looked behind them. The campfire's light was gone. The path they'd taken had become distorted in the dark. Jake stopped. His flashlight swung wildly in his hand as a shadow passed quickly over the dunes, too fast to be human. Then, another flicker of light, this time closer, drawing them further. It was moving, like a star falling toward the earth, or something watching them. They called out for Ben again, but the light only flickered faster. And then Jake saw it. A figure, small, just a silhouette at first, walking across the dunes toward the light. It wasn't Ben, no, the posture was wrong, too stiff, too deliberate. But it didn't matter. They didn't question it. At this point, they were desperate for answers. The figure was moving toward the light, no, walking with it, as if the two were somehow connected, like a moth to a flame. The two friends ran, now with a sense of urgency. But with each step, the dunes seemed to grow taller, stretching endlessly into the darkness. The light stayed the same distance away, no matter how fast they moved. It was mocking them. Finally, they reached the point where they'd last seen Ben's figure. But there was nothing, no Ben, no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. They searched frantically, but all that was left was that strange light, just out of reach, beckoning them to come closer. Jake shouted for Ben once more. No answer, just the howling of the wind. The figure came closer now, stepping into the light. But it wasn't Ben. It was something else. It was wrong. The shape didn't make sense. It wasn't quite human, but it was moving like it was. Then, without warning, the light blinked out again. And in the dark, they heard something that made their blood run cold. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, but unmistakable. They turned and ran back the way they came, but the ground beneath them seemed to shift, the dunes folding in on themselves like something alive. By the time they made it back to the campsite, panting and disoriented, Ben was still missing. They couldn't explain what happened, or why the light seemed to call them deeper and deeper into the dunes. The search that followed was fruitless. No body, no trace. And Ben vanished, as if he had never existed at all. The following days revealed something even more disturbing. Their friends and family, who had known Ben their whole lives, reported strange occurrences. They would swear they saw him in the distance at odd times, his silhouette barely visible in the corners of their eyes. But whenever they looked directly, he was gone. And then, something worse happened. It wasn't just Ben who vanished. Every year, around the same time, the same date, the light would reappear. It was always faint, barely noticeable at first, but always present. People who were brave or foolish enough to follow it would disappear too, as if absorbed by the dunes themselves. The locals speak in whispers about the dunes now, warning travelers never to venture out at night. They tell stories of the light that leads people into a place from which they can never return. No one knows what it really is, but there are those who claim the dunes themselves have become a sort of doorway, portal, a space between this world and something else. Some believe the light is a lure, a trap for the unwary, a place where lost souls wander, waiting for the next person to cross their path. Others think it's more ancient, something tied to the land itself, a force older than the waves crashing on the shore. something that feeds on the curiosity of the living, drawing them in, never letting them leave. Maybe it's a warning, maybe it's a test, or maybe it's something far worse, an invitation to a place where time bends, where those who follow the light are never meant to return. It was supposed to be just another summer day. The sun beat down from a cloudless sky, the waves crashed lazily against the shore, and the salty breeze filled the air with the promise of relaxation. For Clara and her younger brother, Max, it was their first trip to the beach in years, a break from the city, a welcome respite from the weight of life. But when Clara sat down to watch Max build his sandcastle, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, and that feeling only grew stronger as the day wore on. Max had been a curious child, always with a wild imagination, and that day at the beach was no different. He was determined to create the biggest, most elaborate sandcastle anyone had ever seen, even though Clara kept reminding him it was just a pile of sand. He didn't listen to her, though. He was too focused, his small hands digging and shaping with unnatural intensity. "Look, Clara, look how big it's getting," Max shouted, his face lit with excitement as he patted down the walls of his growing creation. Clara smiled weakly, distracted by the distant hum of the ocean, the salty air, and the feeling that something was wrong, even though she couldn't quite place it. As Max worked, Clara noticed something strange. The sand around the castle seemed darker than it should have been. At first, she thought it was just the shadow of the sun dipping lower in the sky, but as she squinted, she could see that the sand was almost wet, though no waves had come up that far. She chalked it up to her imagination. After all, it was hot out, and the beach often played tricks with the eyes in the glare of the midday sun. But then, something caught her eye, a dark, almost crimson stain appearing on the side of Max's sandcastle. "Max!" Clara's voice faltered as she stood up, stepping closer to the structure. Max didn't hear her. His hands were still at work, shaping another turret at the top of the castle, his small face scrunched with determination. "Max!" Clara said more urgently, but there was no response. Her feet sunk into the sand as she walked closer, the reddish stain spreading along the walls of the sandcastle. Her heart skipped a beat when she reached the structure. The stain wasn't just discoloration of the sand. It was as if the sand was bleeding, slowly oozing a dark liquid, pooling on the beach and staining the grains with something that wasn't just water. Max was oblivious, his attention fixed entirely on his creation. But Clara could see the truth now. It was no longer just a game of sand, it was something far darker. "Max!" she shouted, grabbing his shoulder roughly. Max blinked at her, his wide eyes filled with confusion. "What's wrong?" Clara struggled to speak. Her voice felt caught in her throat, as if it had been swallowed by the oppressive weight of the air. "Do you see that?" she asked, her finger trembling as it pointed to the bleeding sandcastle. Max turned his head, and his eyes widened in disbelief. The dark stain had spread, now dripping from the castle's turrets and pooling into the surrounding sand. He stepped back slowly, a shadow passing over his innocent face. "It wasn't me," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I didn't make it happen." Clara's blood ran cold. She looked around the beach, trying to make sense of it, but there was no one else around, no one but the two of them. And still, the stain continued to grow, bleeding through the sand with an almost unnatural persistence. Clara felt a chill creep up her spine. The air had suddenly grown colder, despite the heat of the day. The waves, which had once seemed so soothing, now crashed violently against the shore as if in a frantic, almost desperate rhythm. Something was out of place. Something was wrong. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, the beach grew darker, and Clara's unease grew deeper. She grabbed Max's hand, pulling him away from the castle, but the moment she turned, something strange happened. The sand beneath her feet shifted, like it was alive, sucking her foot down deeper with every step. "Clara, what's happening?" Max cried out, tugging at her arm. Clara looked down. The sand seemed to be moving on its own, not just beneath her feet, but around the entire beach. The ground beneath her seemed to be alive, twisting and contorting like something was rising from below. The dark stain from the sandcastle began to spread in all directions, slowly, insidiously. "Get back!" Clara shouted, trying to pull Max with her, but it was too late. The ground around them began to shift violently, the sand beneath them heaving as if something enormous and unseen was pushing its way to the surface. The castle, which had seemed like a simple child's project just hours ago, now looked like the entry point to something far older and far more sinister. And then the sound came, a deep, guttural ripple, as if the earth itself was groaning under a heavy weight. The sandcastle screamed, not in the way a living thing might scream, but in the way a force trapped beneath the earth would scream in frustration, longing to break free. Clara froze, her body trembling. Max tugged at her arm, crying out, but she couldn't move. She was drawn to the castle, as though the blood-stained sand was calling to her, pulling her closer with every step. The ground beneath her feet cracked, the earth splitting open as if some ancient force, some forgotten thing, was waking from its slumber. With a violent shudder, the sandcastle collapsed, sinking into the earth, leaving nothing but a jagged hole. The dark stain was gone now, leaving only clean sand, the beach once again looking peaceful, serene. Max was crying now, his small hands clutching her tightly, his sobs filling the air. "What was that, Clara? What happened?" Clara didn't know how to answer. How could she explain that the castle wasn't just a child's creation, but a manifestation of something far older than either of them could comprehend? She didn't know. She didn't have an answer. As they left the beach, the sky darkened completely, and Clara felt a coldness she couldn't shake. The thing that had risen from beneath the sand wasn't gone. It was still there, watching, waiting for the next time someone dared to build on its shores. And in the back of her mind, Clara couldn't help but wonder, what else had the sandcastle been hiding? What had it been trying to tell her before it bled and vanished into the earth? One thing was certain. The beach was no longer the peaceful place it had once seemed. The ocean was always waiting, and the sand had a dark secret, buried deep beneath its shifting surface. As they walked away, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them home, something that would never leave, and she wasn't sure if she ever wanted to go back to the beach again. But then again, perhaps it wasn't the beach that was dangerous. Maybe it was the people who believed they were safe there. Started small. A misplaced water bottle here, a flipped-over tent peg there. At first, they brushed it off as the wind, the playful push of a curious animal, or perhaps the slip of a tired mind. But as the days stretched on, the disturbances grew more deliberate, more unsettling. The four friends, Maria, Jake, Sarah, and Tom, had decided to spend their weekend at a secluded beach campsite far from civilization. It was the kind of place only the locals knew about, the kind where the air smelled like salt and pine, and the only sounds were the crashing waves and the occasional chirp of distant birds. Perfect retreat, or so they thought. The first night passed without incident. They set up their tent with practiced hands, unrolled their sleeping bags, and lit a small fire. The evening was calm, the kind of quiet that wraps around you like a thick blanket. They sat by the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. Nothing out of the ordinary. But as the fire flickered and the night deepened, a strange feeling crept over them. A feeling they couldn't quite name, but they all felt it. The next morning, they woke up to a strange sight. The campsite was different, not in a catastrophic way, but enough to send a chill down their spines. The fire pit, which had been carefully arranged the night before, was now scattered with broken sticks and charred wood. The blankets they had left piled neatly in the corner of the tent were now folded in half, perfectly placed. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They exchanged uneasy glances, shrugging it off as a trick of the mind or a restless animal. After all, the area was filled with wildlife. But as the sun dipped low again, they could feel it. The weight of the air was heavier, thicker somehow. They tried to distract themselves with more campfire stories, but each crackle from the flames sounded more ominous than before. The wind began to pick up, rustling the trees, bending the grass in odd angles. Maria caught a glimpse of something dark moving at the edge of the camp, something that shouldn't have been there, a shape too large for a fox moving unnaturally fast through the underbrush. But when she turned back, it was gone. "Did you see that?" Maria asked quietly, her voice tight. Jake, who had been the most skeptical about their location to begin with, scoffed. "It's just the wind, Maria. Nothing more." But he couldn't deny the growing unease in his own chest. The air was thick now, charged with something inexplicable. And as the night wore on, the cracks in the illusion began to show. By the third night, the disturbances were no longer subtle. When they woke up the next morning, it was clear. The campsite had been rearranged once again. This time it was worse. The tent had been moved. It wasn't just a few inches. It had been shifted by several feet. The stakes pulled from the ground. The fabric wrinkled as though something had dragged it across the earth. The logs in the fire pit had been expertly stacked into a neat pile, as if someone had taken great care to make sure it looked perfect. Their backpacks were placed in a perfect line at the edge of the campsite, as though they had been waiting for someone to pick them up and leave. No animal could do this. No wind could be this deliberate. "We need to leave," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with panic. "This isn't right. Something's here, and it knows we're here." Tom nodded, his face pale, his usually confident demeanor cracking. I don't think we can just leave." Jake, who had always been the most level-headed of the group, looked around nervously. He wanted to believe there was a rational explanation. Some prank, some coincidence, but deep down he knew this wasn't a joke. This wasn't nature at work. There was something else out here. Something watching them, something that wanted them to stay. That night, they sat in silence, huddled close to the fire. The temperature had dropped, and the wind howled through the trees, making the flames flicker in strange, ghostly patterns. Every creak of the trees, every rustle in the bushes, seemed to carry a message, a warning. And then, in the dead of night, the sound they feared came. The faintest rustle of fabric. The unmistakable sound of something moving. Something heavy, something deliberate. They sat up, their hearts pounding, waiting for the noise to stop. But it didn't. It continued, circling the campsite, as if whatever it was studying them. "Do you hear that?" Maria gasped. Jake's throat was dry, his eyes darting around in the dark. "We're not alone." Sarah clutched Tom's arm, her fingers trembling. "What do we do?" Tom didn't answer. Instead, he reached for his flashlight, pointing it into the darkness. The beam of light cut through the trees, illuminating only shadows that seemed to move just beyond its reach. And then, for the first time, they heard it. A low, guttural sound. A voice, perhaps, but not one they recognized. It was a sound that came from deep in the earth, a sound that made their blood run cold. "Leave," it whispered. "Leave, or stay forever." The flashlight flickered, dimming for just a moment, and in that instant the campsite changed once again. The tent was moved, and now in its place stood a new structure, one that had not been there before. A small wooden shack, old and weathered, with the same intricate carvings they had seen etched into the logs of the fire pit. The voice spoke again, clearer now, closer. "You've already stayed too long." Fear gripped them all at once, and without a word, they scrambled to pack up their things. Their hands shook as they tried to gather their belongings, but something was wrong. Their bags were heavier now, as if filled with sand, with weight that didn't belong to them. As they turned to leave, Tom caught sight of something by the shack. A figure, pale and unmoving, standing in the doorway. But when he looked again, it was gone. They ran. They didn't stop until they reached their car, but even then, they didn't feel safe. The road back was long, the dark sky pressing down on them, but the feeling of being watched, of being followed, never left. Days later, when they returned to their homes, the police found no trace of the campsite. No evidence of their tents, their fire pit, or the shack that had appeared. The location on the map was blank, as if the area had been erased from existence. No one else had ever reported anything strange. No one but them. The sun was setting. The waves were calm, gentle against the shoreline. But beneath the surface, something else stirred. The quiet whisper of the tide was broken by a sound. A scream. No one could tell if it was human, animal, or something in between. But when the fishermen heard it, they knew the beach would never be the same. Started out as a normal evening. A group of friends decided to spend their weekend at an isolated beach house, nestled on a remote stretch of coastline far from the city's chaos. The waves, the salty air, the feeling of sand between their toes. Everything about it seemed perfect. They were looking for escape, a place to disconnect from the pressures of life and unwind. By the second night, they had already fallen into a relaxing rhythm. Late-night swims, bonfires, and ghost stories. But something about that evening felt off. A low, eerie hum hung in the air, almost like a distant cry carried by the wind. The sound was too constant to ignore, like a siren call tugging at something deep inside their subconscious. One of the group, Emma, was the first to notice the strange object floating offshore. At first, it appeared to be a buoy, its bright colors faint in the twilight haze. The thing had been drifting just beyond the horizon, moving erratically, as though caught in the current. But something about it felt unnatural, too still, too purposeful. "Is that a buoy?" she asked, squinting against the darkening sky. Her friend Jacob, a skeptic of anything even remotely unsettling, laughed it off. "Yeah, it's a buoy. It's what they use for navigation. No big deal." But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The way it bobbed on the waves. The way it didn't sway with the tides like everything else. It was as if it was waiting for something, or someone. As the evening wore on, the rest of the group pushed the eerie feeling aside, too wrapped up in their fun to acknowledge the growing tension. But Emma couldn't ignore the pull in her chest. She stood by the water's edge, watching that same buoy. The wind picked up, causing the waves to crash a little harder, and that was when it happened. A scream, a sharp human cry, coming from the water. Emma froze, her heart pounding in her ears. It was faint, distant, but unmistakably real. She whipped her head around to look at her friends, but they hadn't heard it. They were still laughing, oblivious to the horrifying sound that had just torn through the night. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jacob shook his head. "Hear what?" Before she could respond, the sound came again, louder this time. It echoed across the water, carrying a desperation that cut straight through the silence. "Someone's out there," Emma whispered. Her eyes darted to the buoy, now eerily close to the shore, bobbing up and down as though it had a mind of its own. They all stared in silence for a long moment, but when no one else seemed alarmed, Emma's unease deepened. "We need to check it out," she said. Reluctantly, Jacob stood up. "It's probably just some kids messing around. Let's not make a scene." But Emma's gut told her otherwise. There was something wrong with that buoy, and something wrong in the water. They walked closer, their footsteps hesitant on the damp sand. The closer they got to the water, the louder the scream became. It sounded almost as though it was coming from inside the buoy itself, as though something or someone was trapped inside it. The other friends were still not convinced, brushing it off as some odd trick of the wind or an animal in distress. But as Emma and Jacob reached the water's edge, they saw something truly horrifying. The buoy wasn't just a buoy, it was a trap. Something had tethered it to the ocean floor, and that something was far darker than a simple navigation tool. There was something inside it, a presence that hummed, a pulsing energy that sent shivers down Emma's spine. The closer they got, the more the scream intensified, until it was nearly deafening. But there was no sign of anyone, no sign of a struggle, just that scream rising and falling with the waves. The group decided to call it a night, uneasy but too frightened to investigate further. But Emma couldn't let it go. She lay awake for hours, staring out the window at the dark ocean, the sound of the waves growing louder in her mind, their whispers blending with that horrifying scream. By morning, it had stopped. The buoy was gone, nowhere to be found. It had disappeared into the depths of the sea, just like the scream. Weeks passed, but the strange feeling stayed with them. Each of them tried to dismiss it, to chalk it up to nerves, but deep down they all knew something had been out there. Something alive. Something that had been trying to make contact with them. Years later, Emma returned to the same beach. The memories of that night still clung to her, and when she stepped onto the sand, she felt that same weight in the air. The same chill, the same sense of being watched. She was older now, wiser perhaps, but that fear never quite left her. She walked along the water's edge, her eyes scanning the horizon, as if expecting to see the buoy once more. But it wasn't the buoy she found. It was something worse, something she had never expected. A single, screaming buoy, floating in the middle of the ocean, and in the distance someone or something watching her from the water. The truth was, the scream didn't come from a human. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a lure, a siren's call. And once you hear it, you can never unhear it. The ocean doesn't forget. And neither does the thing that calls from beneath the waves. It waits for you. The cave that echoed someone else's breathing. You've heard the sound before. That slight whoosh, the subtle rise and fall of breath, as if someone is standing right behind you. But when you turn, there's nothing. You were alone. Or were you? In the remote stretches of a quiet coastal town, there's a cave known to few. Its jagged entrance rests under a cliff, half hidden by a veil of overgrown vegetation. It's a place where locals say no one should wander. It's a place that breathes, or so the stories go. Hannah didn't believe in ghost stories. To her, they were just tales passed down by superstitious old folks. The kind of stories meant to keep you out of places you shouldn't be. But when she and her friends decided to explore the cave that afternoon, she had no idea how wrong she was about everything. It started innocuously enough. A group of young adventurers, eager to spend a day exploring the coast, stumbled upon the cave. The tide was low, the sun still high. There were no signs to warn them away, just the faint, forgotten remnants of a path long since abandoned. The entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for them to squeeze through. It was damp and dark inside, the sound of dripping water echoing eerily through the small chamber. But it was what they couldn't see, what they couldn't hear at first, that made the cave so unsettling. Hannah felt it first, the sudden shift in the air. The temperature dropped a few degrees, but it wasn't the cold that made her shiver. It was something else. The hairs on her neck stood up, her skin prickling as if something was watching her, following her every movement. She couldn't explain it, but she felt it deep in her gut. She turned to her friends, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you feel that?" They nodded, but only one of them, Jake, dared to speak. "It's just the air," he said with a laugh, but even his voice had a slight tremble to it. Old caves do that, but Hannah couldn't shake the feeling. She told herself it was nothing, just nerves, the usual unease that came with being somewhere dark and unfamiliar. But as they ventured deeper into the cave, the atmosphere became heavier. The walls pressed in around them, the air thick with the smell of salt and earth. And then that sound, a breath, a soft, slow inhale, followed by a long exhale. Hannah stopped in her tracks, her heart racing. She turned around quickly, but her friends were still ahead of her, a few steps out of view. There was no one else in the cave. No one else could have made the sound. Her pulse quickened. She forced herself to take a deep breath. It's nothing. It's just the wind, or maybe the way the rocks reverberate. But something in her didn't believe that. Not anymore. She caught up to the others, but the feeling didn't leave her. Every few steps, she swore she could hear the breath again. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, in and out, a rhythm, as if someone or something was mirroring her every movement. The others didn't seem to notice. They were laughing, taking pictures, poking around the walls of the cave, examining the layers of ancient rock. But Hannah couldn't let it go. Every corner, every shadow seemed to conceal something just out of sight. She could feel the cave itself breathing, alive, aware, waiting. As they reached the farthest point of the cave, a narrow passage opened up into a small chamber. The air here felt heavier, almost suffocating. There was a large rock in the center, partially illuminated by the faint light from their flashlights. The walls were slick with moisture, and the oppressive silence was broken only by the sound of their breathing and something else. Hannah froze again, her stomach tightening. There it was, that same breath. It wasn't hers. It wasn't any of her friends. She turned to Jake, but when she opened her mouth to speak, she saw the look in his eyes. He'd heard it too. He was staring, wide-eyed, at the far wall, where a faint, almost imperceptible outline seemed to shimmer in the dim light. It was there, a shadow, a figure, crouched low, breathing softly but deliberately. It was as if it was waiting for them to move closer. But there was no way it could be real. No one could be hidden in that tiny chamber. Hannah's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She stepped back slowly, but Jake reached out to stop her, his hand trembling. "Do you hear it?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the pulse in her ears. The breathing, it wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a presence. It was closing in, suffocating the air around them. They could all hear it now, each of them frozen in place as the sound of breathing grew louder, more pronounced. But there was no figure in the chamber, no one behind them. Then, a voice, soft and hoarse, broke through the silence. "Leave." The word came from everywhere, reverberating off the walls, echoing in the very air they breathed. It wasn't human. Hannah felt her legs weaken. Her eyes darted around, but all she could see were the shadows, moving, shifting, alive in a way that nothing should be. "Go," the voice whispered again, closer this time, a cold breath against her ear. Panic set in. They turned and ran, scrambling through the narrow passage they had come from, each of them desperate to escape whatever was watching, waiting in that cave. But as they reached the entrance, the breath followed them. Close, too close. The air felt thick, impossibly heavy, pressing against their lungs. Every step felt like it might be their last. When they finally emerged into the daylight, gasping for air, the cave seemed to exhale with them, releasing them into the open air. But the feeling lingered. The air felt wrong, as if the cave had never truly let go of them. And no matter how far they walked, they couldn't escape that sense. That someone or something was still breathing just behind them. What had they really encountered in that cave? Was it a trick of the mind, or was the cave itself alive, aware, and perhaps haunting those who dared to enter? The question stayed with Hannah long after she left that coastal town, gnawing at her thoughts. She never spoke about it again, but the breath, oh the breath, still echoed in her ears, day and night, a reminder of the hidden, darker things waiting beneath the surface. Sometimes, when the air is still and the night is too quiet, you can almost hear it. Inhale, exhale, and you wonder, what if it's still following you? The waves were calm that day, but something about the beach felt different. The air had a strange chill, the kind that wrapped around your bones and refused to let go. It was mid-afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows over the wet sand. But it wasn't the beauty of the beach that caught Sarah's attention. It was the movement, the faint ripple of something in the water, just beyond the shoreline. She paused for a moment, squinting at the horizon, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. There, out in the open water, her reflection waved. It wasn't the reflection of her standing on the sand, her back to the ocean. No, it was a perfect image, identical to her, but in the water, it was as if she stood inside the sea itself, perfectly mirrored but with a slight difference. The reflection was waving at her, beckoning her in. At first, Sarah dismissed it as a trick of the light or a result of the shimmering water playing with her eyes. She shook her head, feeling foolish. But then it happened again. The reflection in the water moved. Sarah blinked hard. Her heart began to race. She took a step forward, mesmerized, her body drawn to the oddity. The figure in the water, identical in every way, waved again, this time more insistently. A sudden, sharp breeze swept across the beach, and Sarah felt her skin prickle. Her body wanted to turn away, to run back to the safety of the path leading to the parking lot. but her feet felt frozen in place. Her eyes locked onto the figure that mirrored her every movement, except for that wave. She couldn't look away. Something about it felt wrong. There was a presence there, just beneath the surface, something far darker than she'd initially believed. She stepped closer to the water, instinctively wanting to reach out, but with every step, the figure in the water seemed to move further out. The reflection was leading her. Her heart hammered against her chest as she neared the edge of the water. She stopped. The waves lapped at her feet, sending a cold shiver through her legs. The reflection was still there, still waving. It felt like it was watching her, waiting for something. And then, there was a sound. Not the familiar crash of waves against the shore. No, this was a soft, haunting whisper. A voice coming from the ocean.
Come closer.
It wasn't her voice. The voice was deeper, softer, and impossibly familiar, as if it belonged to her, but not quite. The water rippled in time with the words, as though the ocean itself was speaking directly to her. Something shifted in the depths. A sudden, sharp movement beneath the surface, but too fast to see. The reflection seemed to hesitate, and for just a moment, Sarah saw the change. A slight distortion in the water, an odd flicker of something that didn't belong. Was it a hand or something darker, reaching from below? The voice came again, insistent now.
Come closer, Sarah.
Terror flooded her chest. This wasn't right. This wasn't just some strange reflection or a trick of the mind. There was something in the ocean, and it was waiting for her. With a sudden burst of panic, she turned to run. But as she did, something tugged at her ankle. Cold, clammy fingers wrapping around her foot, pulling her toward the water. She stumbled backward, but the grip tightened, dragging her closer to the surf. Her breath hitched in her throat as she fought against the invisible force. Her feet sank into the wet sand, but it felt like something beneath the surface was pulling her deeper, down into the cold, dark abyss. She struggled harder, her hands clawing at the sand, but it was no use. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the tugging stopped. The reflection in the water waved once more, but now it wasn't a welcoming gesture. It was mocking, a taunting invitation as if to say, "You should have come." Sarah stumbled backward, her heart pounding, her breath ragged. She tore her gaze from the water, shaking her head violently, willing herself to leave. As she backed away, she glanced one last time at the ocean. The reflection was gone. The water was still again, as if nothing had ever happened. But something had, something that wasn't over. Sarah left the beach in a daze, the taste of salt still heavy on her lips, her mind spinning. She never returned to that beach, but the nightmares came every night. She dreamed she was back on that shore, and each time, the figure would rise from the ocean to wave at her, calling her back. Days later, Sarah saw something strange in her bathroom mirror. Her reflection didn't just mimic her movements. It was different. The face was darker, the eyes deeper, and in the blink of an eye, her reflection waved. The story leaves us wondering, what happens when we can't escape the things that haunt us? Is the ocean a literal force, or is it the manifestation of something deeper, something within Sarah herself? The horror doesn't just end with the wave. It lingers in her reflection, a constant reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones we can't outrun, no matter how far we try to go. There's an old saying, the ocean always takes what it wants. It's a phrase you hear whispered among fishermen, beachgoers, and sailors. A warning. But for some, that warning is something they only learn the hard way when it's too late. And for one man, it wasn't a matter of if the ocean would take him, but when. It all started with a group of friends, 5 to be exact, on a quiet stretch of beach on the outer edge of a small town. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway. They'd been planning it for months. 4 days of sun, waves, and late-night bonfires.
No responsibilities. No distractions.
Just the salt air and the sound of waves crashing against the shore. But from the moment they stepped foot on the sand, something felt off. At first, it was subtle. The air felt heavier than usual, almost as if the ocean itself was holding its breath. But nobody said anything about it. Not yet. There was something hypnotic about the rhythm of the waves that made everything else seem irrelevant. It wasn't until the first night that the unsettling presence started creeping in. They sat around the fire, laughing, joking, sharing stories about past adventures and things they'd seen. The crackling of the fire was almost comforting. But as they talked, one of them, the quiet one, Ben, kept looking out toward the water, his eyes narrowed, his body tense. "Ben, you good?" Sarah asked, breaking him from his trance. He blinked, shaking his head. "Yeah. Just thought I saw something out there." The others dismissed it. A simple trick of the light, a shadow drifting beneath the moonlit waves. But Ben couldn't shake the feeling. The ocean, it was calling to him. The next day they went for a swim. The sky was clear, the sun shining brightly, and the water was inviting. The others splashed around, enjoying the cool respite from the heat, but Ben stayed at the edge, looking out over the horizon. There was a pull to the water, something deeper than just the tides. A magnetic force that seemed to draw him in. He tried to ignore it, but the longer he stared, the stronger the feeling became. He could hear it now, whispers, faint but distinct. The ocean's voice. "Ben, you coming in?" Mike called, laughing as he tread water.
Ben hesitated.
He was just about to respond when something in the water caught his eye. A shadow shifting beneath the surface. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a fish. It wasn't a swimmer. It was something else. The others noticed his frozen stance.
"Ben."
Sarah's voice was sharp now, concerned. "Ben, what's wrong?" But Ben didn't respond. He couldn't. His feet moved before his brain could process the command. He stepped into the water, then waded deeper, moving slowly, hypnotically, toward the shadow beneath the surface. It was as if the waves themselves were guiding him, parting just enough to show him the way.
"Ben."
Mike shouted, his voice filled with panic. "Get back here!" But it was too late. Ben was already waist-deep in the water, his eyes fixed on the dark shape below. The others scrambled to catch up, but they couldn't get close enough. The water seemed to rise, pulling him further out, his body floating as if weightless. "Ben, please," Sarah cried, reaching out in desperation. "Come back. You're scaring us." For a moment it seemed like Ben might listen. He looked over his shoulder, his expression blank, his eyes empty. Then, without warning, the ocean surged forward. Ben's body was pulled beneath the surface, disappearing in an instant. They didn't know what to do. Mike tried to dive in, but the waves were too strong. The water was churning, the foam rising in violent spouts, as if something beneath was angry, thrashing. Minutes passed, hours maybe, but when the tide finally calmed, there was no sign of Ben. The search lasted all night. The police arrived, combing the shoreline, but they found nothing. No body.
"No trace."
Just the restless sea that seemed to mock their efforts. The group stayed at the beach for the remainder of the weekend, but the mood was heavy, suffocating. The air didn't feel right anymore. They packed up and left before the weekend was even over. But as they walked away from the water, something stopped them in their tracks. A single set of footprints appeared in the sand. Just one, leading into the waves. No other tracks, just the single, perfect impression of a foot. The authorities never found Ben's body. The ocean had taken him, and it seemed to have claimed everything that mattered. His friends tried to move on. Some of them returned to the beach years later, but the shadows of that night never left them. It was as if Ben had never truly left. And each of them wondered, was it Ben that the ocean had wanted? Or had it been something else, something even older, that called to him, to all of them? To this day, the beach is empty at night. No one stays. The locals say it's cursed, but the tourists who come never believe it. They never think twice, until the tide comes in. And sometimes, just sometimes, there's a single set of footprints in the sand. Analysis. This story taps into a fundamental fear: the ocean's vast, unknowable nature. The water represents a force too powerful for humans to comprehend. It's ancient, it's mysterious, and it seems to have its own agenda. Ben's attraction to the sea is not just curiosity. It's something darker, an almost magnetic pull, suggesting that the ocean is more than just a body of water. It's alive, aware, and perhaps even malevolent. The group's attempt to move on after Ben's disappearance mirrors a common reaction to trauma, a refusal to acknowledge the supernatural force that caused the horror, opting instead to accept that it was just a tragic accident. The single set of footprints in the sand at the end represents the idea that some things, once they've claimed you, don't let go, and they might not even be human anymore. Ben's fate could be seen as a metaphor for how the ocean calls to us all, pulling us toward it with promises of peace, beauty, or escape. But in the end, the sea doesn't care. It doesn't take what we expect it to, takes what it wants. And sometimes we never get the chance to leave. This story leaves us with a lingering question. What if the ocean isn't just a place, but a thing, an entity with motives that we can't fathom? And what if one of us, one day, becomes the next footprint in the sand? The beach was calm, peaceful even, the kind of place you'd expect to find solace. A place where the sky seemed to stretch endlessly, and the salty air filled your lungs with a sense of freedom. But for Lily, there was always an unease, something she couldn't quite place. She had been coming to this beach for years, ever since she was a little girl. It was a place of family, of quiet afternoons spent collecting seashells and watching the tide. This time, however, it felt different. The wind carried a peculiar chill, the kind that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. It wasn't the usual crisp breeze she'd come to know. There was something wrong, but she shrugged it off. After all, it was just a beach, wasn't it? As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting an orange glow across the waves, Lily found herself walking alone along the shore. Her friends had gone ahead, already planning their bonfire for the evening. But Lily liked the solitude. There was something comforting about being alone with the ocean, as though the vast expanse of water could swallow up her thoughts and quiet her mind. It was then that she noticed it, a small, iridescent shell, half buried in the sand. It was unlike any she'd seen before. The shell shimmered with a strange, almost unnatural glow, catching the light in a way that made it seem alive. Intrigued, she bent down to pick it up, feeling a sudden, inexplicable pull to it. As soon as her fingers brushed its surface, a chill ran down her spine. And then she heard it, a soft whisper, so faint she almost thought she had imagined it. It sounded like the wind at first, but it wasn't. The voice was too clear, too intentional. Her heart skipped a beat. Lily! She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her name. It had called her name. She quickly glanced around, half expecting to see someone standing behind her. But the beach was empty, the only sound now the distant hum of the waves. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought as a trick of her imagination. It was just the wind. It had to be. But the whisper came again, more insistent this time. Lily! This time there was no mistaking it. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. Something from the depths of the sea, reaching out to her. Her fingers tightened around the shell, and she felt a strange warmth radiating from it. It was as though the shell was pulsing, alive with some unseen force. She pulled it closer to her ear, half expecting to hear the ocean inside, as you often do with seashells. But instead, there was only the whisper, clearer now, as though the sea itself were speaking to her. Come to me. Lily's pulse quickened. The world around her seemed to blur, the horizon fading into an endless void. She felt the pull of the voice, a magnetic force drawing her deeper into the unknown. Her mind screamed for her to turn back, to drop the shell and run, but her body didn't listen. She was hypnotized, entranced by the soft cadence of the voice calling her name. And then something more unnerving happened. As Lily stood there, staring at the shell, the whisper grew louder, its tone shifting, as if it were no longer a voice, but a command, a demand from something far darker.
Lily, come closer.
Her eyes widened in fear, but she couldn't move. It was as though the beach had become a trap, the sand beneath her feet sinking deeper, pulling her toward the ocean. She tried to drop the shell, to let go of the strange force that gripped her, but her hand wouldn't obey. The shell seemed to be holding her, keeping her there, rooted to the spot. The air around her grew thick, as though the sky itself were pressing down on her, suffocating her. The waves were no longer distant. They were right there, crashing violently against the shore, a dark and threatening presence just beyond her reach. And then she saw it. In the distance, barely visible through the dimming light of the fading day, a figure began to emerge from the surf. It was barely more than a silhouette, tall and thin, with long, flowing hair that trailed behind it like seaweed. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as if it were wading through something far deeper than water. Lily's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't a person. This wasn't anything human. It was something else. The whisper came again, louder now, reverberating in her chest, as though it were speaking directly to her soul. "Lily, come to me." The figure took a step closer, its features still indistinct, obscured by the mist that began to roll in from the ocean. But Lily could feel it now, a presence she couldn't explain. The voice was inside her head, inside her heart, pulling her, commanding her to come closer. It was no longer a request. It was a need, a hunger that demanded to be satisfied. Her legs moved of their own accord, carrying her toward the water. She was no longer thinking, no longer questioning. All that mattered was the voice, the pull, the unrelenting call that echoed in her mind. And then, as she stepped into the water, the figure disappeared. For a moment, everything was still. The water lapped gently at her feet, the whispering voice fading into silence. But Lily didn't feel the relief she expected. Instead, she felt empty, hollow, like something had been taken from her, something vital, something irreplaceable. She turned around, scanning the beach, but the shell was gone, and so was the whisper. But something remained, a coldness, a heaviness in the air, an unsettling silence that pressed down on her like a weight. Lily ran back to her friends, her heart pounding, her mind reeling. She never spoke of the voice, of the figure, of the shell. She never returned to that beach. And though she tried to forget, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her. Something that would always be there, waiting. And somewhere, deep beneath the waves, the shell still whispered her name. The truth about the shell remains a mystery, but perhaps that's the most terrifying part of all. Some things are not meant to be understood. Some things should never be called. And sometimes, when you hear your name on the wind, it's a reminder that you've crossed a line, and there's no going back. Have you ever felt that pull, that voice? Or are you brave enough to dismiss it as just the wind? Because in the end, the sea is vast, and not all things that rise from it are meant to return. Would you listen if it whispered your name? It started with a whisper, a warning that no one heeded. The clouds gathered in strange patterns, never quite like any storm anyone had ever seen. But no one believed it could happen. A storm, localized to a single patch of land? That was impossible, wasn't it? But by the time the skies grew dark, and the wind shifted into something unnatural, it was already too late. This wasn't just a storm. It was a warning for something far worse. A beach that would never be the same again. The sun hung lazily in the sky that afternoon. Most of the people on Sundale Beach were enjoying a typical summer day. Surfing, swimming, lounging on towels, or playing volleyball. The type of day people come to the beach for, relaxing, carefree. There were no signs that anything was amiss. Not yet. But in the distance, barely noticeable, the sky began to shift. It wasn't an immediate change, just the faintest distortion in the color of the clouds, a change from the usual cotton white to something darker, almost like bruises. There was no thunder, no wind, just a stillness that was almost too quiet. A few people on the beach commented on the oddity of the sky, but most shrugged it off, too lost in their own activities to think anything of it. It wasn't until the lifeguard, Mark, noticed the line of dark water on the horizon that he felt the first chill run down his spine. It wasn't like any approaching storm he had seen before. This wasn't the typical shift in tides, the typical swell that came before a downpour. The water itself seemed wrong. Too still, too calm, and the air grew unnaturally warm. As Mark stood at his post, scanning the beach, he noticed that no one seemed to be concerned. People were still swimming, still chatting, still relaxing on the sand. He called out to a few, advising them to start heading in, but his warnings went unheeded. It wasn't until a shrill wind tore across the sand that things began to shift. The wind was violent out of nowhere. It wasn't like the usual gusts that come with a summer breeze. It wasn't playful. It was harsh, ripping at towels, flipping umbrellas, pulling sand from the shore like it was alive. People started to panic, their joy turning into confusion and then fear. What was happening? Where had this wind come from? And then, without warning, the sky shattered. The sun, which had been barely hanging in the sky, dipped behind the horizon in seconds, leaving the beach bathed in unnatural twilight. The temperature plummeted. A few screams pierced the air as the first droplets of rain fell. Not the light, refreshing kind that most people expected, but heavy, thick drops that seemed to sizzle as they hit the sand. The rain smelled wrong. It wasn't the clean scent of the ocean. It was like rust, metal, and something bitter, something that shouldn't belong on a beach. In the distance, Mark saw something he couldn't explain. The storm was only affecting one section of the beach, right where the sand met the water. It wasn't like the usual kind of weather system that would engulf an entire area. No, this storm was localized, an unnatural phenomenon that was confined to this specific patch of sand. The surfers, who had been out riding the waves just moments before, were now struggling to get back to shore. The waves, which had once been gentle, were now monstrous, towering and thrashing like something alive, something vengeful. Mark felt his stomach drop as the crashing waves seemed to defy logic. Some crashing high, others strangely curling and collapsing inward, as though they were moving with a will of their own. It wasn't until the first person vanished that the full weight of the horror hit. A young woman, clinging to her board, screamed as a wave surged forward and engulfed her. But it wasn't like drowning. The water didn't just pull her under, it took her. One moment she was there, her terrified eyes wide as she reached for the shore, and the next, the water closed over her like she never existed at all. There was no struggle, no sound, just a wave of foam where she once was. Mark's heart hammered in his chest. He knew then that something was wrong. This wasn't just a freak storm. This was something much worse. Something unnatural. Something that wasn't bound by the normal rules of nature. As the storm raged on, more and more people were pulled into the waves. The beach that had been full of life just hours ago was now a scene of chaos. People screamed, but their voices were swallowed by the howling winds. Some tried to run up the beach, but the wind forced them back. Others tried to flee into the parking lot, only to find the exits blocked by fallen trees, debris, and the sea rising unnaturally high. The storm didn't stop at just the wind and waves. No, it was more than that. The beach itself seemed to be alive. The sand shifted underfoot as if something was moving beneath it. Something large. People felt themselves being pulled, as if invisible hands were tugging at their ankles, holding them to the ground. The ground itself was turning against them. The most unsettling part? The storm only hit Sundale Beach. The neighboring beaches were untouched. The sky there was calm, the winds light. People there stood at the edge of the sand, staring at the chaos unfolding just miles away. But they couldn't do anything to help. The storm didn't just isolate people physically. It isolated them emotionally, too. No one could reach them. As Mark tried to rescue as many people as he could, he realized there was no escape. The storm was saturating the very air around them, filling it with something ancient, something old, something alive. The beach was its domain. The sand was shifting because it was hungry. The water was rising because it was waiting for more to claim. And the people? They were nothing more than offerings. By the time the storm finally subsided, only a handful of people were left. The beach was silent. The sun, which had briefly returned, now hung low, casting a sickly light on the deserted stretch of sand. The sand itself, as if mourning the violence it had witnessed, was empty. No footprints, no remnants of the chaos that had just unfolded. When authorities arrived, they found nothing but the wreckage. A few survivors clinging to whatever debris they could find. The rest, gone, as if the storm had erased them from existence. No one could explain it. No one could explain how the storm had appeared, or why it had only affected Sundale Beach. Theories floated around. Was it a freak natural occurrence? Some said it was a cursed beach, that something ancient had been disturbed. Others whispered that it was the sea itself, angry with the people who had taken its shores for granted. But the truth is, no one really knows. And to this day, no one dares to visit that stretch of beach again. Sundale Beach remains untouched, a place forgotten by time, as though nature itself has erased it from memory. The people who were lost, were they taken by the storm? Or were they claimed by something older, something lurking beneath the waves, waiting for the right moment to rise again? The beach will remain, but the question is, will we, or will the storm come back for us all?